want to talk first of all in a very personal way about my reaction to the COVID crisis. Like everybody else, when this swept through Europe and then the rest of the world in February and then into March, I assumed it was going to be really quite short term. Is that a short, sharp lockdown, hospitals would prepare themselves, a vaccine would be created, and then reasonably soon would be back to normal. That was how I approached these things. And like I think many, many people, I just decided to take that time, that unexpected time without so much pressure, to do things like cleaning the house thoroughly, really. I mean, the house has never looked cleaner. Getting myself fit again. I mean, really, I'm not too bad, but I should do more. And so I did more cycling, more running. I'm fitter now than I have been for years. That's great. But then that finished. I couldn't find anything else in the house to clean, and I couldn't do more running. And so I looked at longer term things, and that included financial planning, because there was a big question. If this was going to go on for a long time, how would I earn my living? How would my colleagues in efesai and other businesses where I'm involved earn a living? Because the cultural sector is where I earn most of the money to pay for food and to pay my rent. And if the cultural sector was so badly hit, well, what would that mean for my income? So I was looking at financial planning and also looking at what ways efesai could help cultural organizations to look long term. And so we have done quite a bit of restructuring and refocusing of what efesai does. These seminars, in fact, are part of that thinking. Cultural organizations, I think, have been through the same process. First, it's a crisis. What do we do? What can we do to help our people? Will we be able to reopen soon? What can we do to make our theatres and museums safe for people to visit, even in smaller numbers? What funding can we get to tide us over these very difficult times? So that's crisis management, but that's over now in the sense that those initial things have been done. And so we didn't want it, but we will all have plenty of time now to think about the long terms of our organization. Because the cultural sector is characterized by really a series of very fast deadlines. The show must start next week. We must finish a production. We must get the set out from the stage and put the new one in. The next collection is coming through in the museum. So the cultural sector is characterized by a series of short-term deadlines. This doesn't leave a great deal of room for introspection, for thinking philosophically, for thinking about business planning. It also means that if you want to make changes to your organization, it's rather like changing the engine of your car whilst you're still driving it. It's very difficult. We have the opportunity now, and I feel we must take it, to really look fundamentally at what we do and how we do it and make changes. Because although making change is never easy, it's easier now than it has been recently. The things we need to look at, I believe, are things that are long overdue for the cultural sector. They're things you have probably already been thinking about. Some of you will already have been doing something about it, others less so. These are things like digital production, digital distribution, digital engagement with audiences, inclusivity and diversity on everybody's agenda, but I don't see very much progress, if I'm very honest. Governance. It's not clear to me that the governance structures of many cultural organizations are actually fit for the purpose that they will have to cover in the future. New income sources. Now, there's been some progress in fundraising in the cultural sector in the last 10 years since I've been working in the Netherlands, but actually far less than they could have been. This really also needs to be changed because funding systems will also change and you will need to find new ways of earning money. Our impact. What is the true impact of a cultural organization? We have value way beyond what we think. Our cultural organizations are far more valuable than they believe. And in fact, we're valuable in ways that we don't even think about, to people we don't even acknowledge. This brings us to the question of then, who do we serve? To whom are we really obliged to pay attention? Not just the audiences, not just the actors, not just the partners, not just the employees in our organizations, not just our artistic partners. We have an impact in our communities, speaking broadly, or in a narrow geographical area, which we should acknowledge and then consider how we work with the people on whom we have an impact. In our first seminar, Yeshua Young from New York, well, from Iceland, and then Germany, and then New York, one of those international people, she said, well, I mean, she said many interesting things. And by the way, the video of that seminar, of her presentation, is available, and we can tell you where to see it after this seminar. We'll send an email to everybody. But the thing that stuck in my mind was she said that the only way forward is outwards. You can't simply look inwards, hide under the table, and hope you can come out again to the same world when everything is over. The only way outwards, the only way forwards is outwards. What she means there is engagement and openness in all kinds of ways. She also, I think, is talking about new collaborations and new partnerships. The problem we have is that our current funding system encourages us to look inwards primarily. We're funded to produce and present artistic work. That's why the money comes through. The main focus, therefore, is generally inwards. What are we producing? Is the work good? Could we do different things? Can we be more creative in what we produce? Can we be more creative in how we present? Can we be more creative in how we explain our work? But fundamentally, the funding system encourages us to look inwards. It does not fund us for social impact. It does not fund us for diversity and inclusion. It does not fund us for creating new business models or new income streams. It could, and maybe it will, but right now it doesn't. And that also means that the funding system, taken overall, I'm talking about public sector funders, local and national government, and also many of the big funds, what they're really funding us is to be conservative. It would be very difficult for a cultural organization, a successful cultural organization, to decide to make big changes in the way it organizes itself, in its structures, in its partnerships, in the income streams. It would be very difficult to do that and be sure that it will continue to get the funding that it has enjoyed up until now. The safest thing to do, and the way that most people operate, is to apply for funding really quite similar in the way they've done that in the past, because that's safe. Very brave, and I don't see many people doing this, to be really creative and go back to basics and say, look, we've decided to do things in a different way because this will take us forward into the future. So the funding system encourages us to look inwards and encourages us to be conservative. The problem is, well, I say problem, maybe it's a good idea, but anyway, the truth is, this will change. The cultural sector in the Netherlands has been very fortunate that this crisis coincided almost exactly with the announcements of funding for the next years from the national government and from local government. And this guarantees income for those successful organizations for a few years to come. That was very fortunate, because when the next round of funding comes along, the funding bodies, local government and national government, will have terrible financial problems. All the money that's being spent now will have to be gathered back somehow. And local government are themselves losing many sources of income because they, in a sense, also trade, and they get money from local taxes, which are being reduced. So local and national government bodies will have far less money in the future. They will also have very different political pressures, because although the cultural sector is suffering, so are other sectors of the economy, restaurants, travel, all suffering terribly. The airlines, they also will be asking for additional funding and additional support. And it's not clear that the cultural sector will succeed in arguing it is a very special case. It's also true that the world is changing around us. We can already see some of the effects of this COVID crisis, effects we know will last long term. Will any large company, will any company now want offices in the city centre? Well, maybe to some extent, but far less, which means that the use of our city centres and town centres will change. By the way, this also applies to cultural organisations. Will you now want your offices? Will more people work remotely? It can be done. We've proved it can be done. So our cities themselves will change. The habits of consumers have already changed dramatically. Suddenly, everything and everybody is online, including seminars like this. And whereas previously, for many people, this was just an afterthought and just convenient that you could talk to your friends in Argentina or Australia, now it's just a routine part of life in terms of how we communicate, in terms of how we produce, and in terms of how we consume, including cultural and entertainment products. And since the cultural sector is in the business of culture and in the business, to some extent, of entertainment, then we'll find that when we get back to reopening our doors fully, that actually the tastes of our audiences, the expectations of our audiences will have changed dramatically. There will be other changes too. But the one thing that's absolutely clear is we cannot reopen our cultural organizations at the end of 21 or in 2022, whenever that might be, and think that we can run our organizations as we did in 2019. That will not work. There's a medical phenomenon. I haven't seen it in the Dutch press, but certainly in English, we talk about long COVID. You have that also in the Netherlands, lange COVID? They've discovered, of course, that many people with COVID symptoms, well, some people have mild symptoms or none. Some people get very sick, and happily, most of those people survive, but after a very intense period of care. But quite a lot of people, whether they had mild symptoms or serious symptoms at first, they have effects of COVID for many months to come. And of course, nobody's yet sure how long that is. I know of at least one director of a cultural organization in the Netherlands who has long COVID, who has not yet been able to go back to work fully because of the effects of COVID, which is still continuing, although she was not that ill in the first place. And so I suggest to you that as well as the long COVID symptoms of individuals who catch the disease, that the cultural sector will suffer from a long COVID. It will not be a crisis that's over in a few weeks or even a few months from now. We need to act accordingly. So what do we need to look at? We need to look at making changes which are going to stick for the long term. We have an opportunity to do this now. We have a problem with resources, which we need to talk about, but we do have at least a bit of time without the pressure of yet another work coming through the theatre or another collection coming through the gallery. And what's the process that we need to go through? And we're following this process more or less in the efesai seminars. That's why we planned them in this way. The first, let's talk seriously about what is our core mission. What's our DNA? Why are we really here? There is a problem, of course, if you set an institution, and particularly if you have a building, is that the institution, the organization itself, the people you already have around you, the building perhaps, the timetable you set yourself, the plans, they become more important than actually why you started in the first place. It's worthwhile anyway, occasionally sitting back and saying, are we really doing what we set out to do? Are we now trapped worrying about the building or about this particular group of people more than we are we're achieving our core mission? Second thing, I think, after identifying DNA, is to identify your full value. And by that, I mean the impact you have on your communities, speaking generally. Now, the artistic impacts and the entertainment impacts, if you want to consider that too, are vital, and they're the center of everything you do. And by the way, when I say community, I include your workers, I include your partners in the artistic world, but I also think about your cities. Economic impact is something that people talk about a lot these days, but you also need to think about social impact on health. And there are plenty of organizations in the Netherlands already considering these things, and there are ways of measuring it. The fifth seminar in our series is exactly about measuring impact and being aware of your full impact, therefore full value on your communities, talking generally about communities. So I recommend you look at that seminar where we have speakers from the Netherlands and from Britain talking about impact identification, measurement, and therefore really identifying the value of your organization and what you can do with that information. And once you think about your impacts, you're forced to think about who you impact. Which people in our communities are we important to? We tend to think about what we find important, probably related to the work itself. But theatres, museums are of importance in their cities as well. They may be very important for groups of people who we don't know very well. So we need to think about to whom are we of value? And let's identify them clearly. Let's be clear about the impact we have on them. And actually, let's engage with them and work out how we can improve that impact. For some, the question of impact is dangerous, because if you're being asked to measure things other than the works on stage, how that was received, maybe audience numbers, if you're being asked also to identify the social impact you have, the impact on the mental and physical well-being of people who are associated with you, that looks like a trap. It really does. It looks like you're being asked to jump through hoops And there is a danger perhaps that you'll get taken away from your real mission, which is the artistic work. Big danger, but it can be avoided. And seminar 5 in our series will be talking about that in more detail. Next thing I think you need to do is to identify your assets. Now, when I say asset, I mean anything that's of value that you could use to leverage new partnerships, possibly new funding. And your assets are things that you may not even think about. For example, if you have a database of audience members, that is an asset. Whichever way you look at it, it's an asset. And you can do things with it you probably don't do right now. Within the law and with their consent, but you can. Your building may be an asset that is underused. I lived and worked in Spain for several years with cultural organizations, and it was depressing to find that almost every theatre was closed. Its doors were literally closed all the time, except 15 minutes before the performance, and then they closed the door again 15 minutes afterwards. All these wonderful buildings, which could have been used for so many things, were simply closed almost all the time, and almost all of them publicly funded. It was very depressing, and in my opinion, a misuse of public money. The Netherlands is much better. Theatre buildings tend to be used far more of the time, but museums and any cultural building could be used far more than it is and used in different ways. I noticed that the Concertgebouw at the moment is allowing educational institutions to use the main concert hall for educational sessions. Lots of seats, lots of space, students can be socially distanced, they have Wi-Fi. So actually, suddenly, that space is being used during the day in a very good way. I don't know the financial arrangements, maybe it's being done for free, but actually that could be done much more. I think you know many examples that I don't know. Once you've identified the assets you have, your building, your network of artistic collaborators around the world, perhaps you are the hub of an international network of artists. Well, actually, in itself, if you're a crucial part of that network, that has a value. You may be part of the civic makeup of your city. Your theatre, your museum are an essential part of the landscape of your city. So identify these assets. And then you think about how can we leverage these assets to further our mission? Always focus on your mission. Finally, if you're going to collaborate with anybody or sell something to somebody, you need to see how they're going to benefit too. But at first you need to think, how can we benefit? How can we use this asset, this value we have, to leverage new collaborations and to leverage new income streams? This creates your strategy. It's actually simple to describe, difficult to do, I appreciate. Identify your core mission, identify your full value, find out who recognizes that value, find out your assets in relation to those values, and think about how you can leverage those assets to achieve your core mission. That's the core of your strategy. One thing to note is that structure follows strategy. There is a problem in many cases that people think first about structures. How can we organize ourselves? Actually, you can't answer that question until you can say, what are we organizing ourselves for? So here's the take home. First strategy, then structure. But once you've got your strategy and you're thinking about new structures, you will realize you may need to make some changes, because for the new world and for potential new funding streams, you will need new structures, and new structures require new people. And now we get to the very painful part. The very painful part is that it's clear that not everybody currently working for and with our cultural organizations will be useful in the future. Bear in mind that our primary responsibility is to deliver our artistic and social mission. We have a responsibility to our employees and people who work with us in a different capacities, volunteers, collaborators. But if in reality, if we're being honest, we can't always continue doing the same things with the same people, then this will have to change. Going back to the list of things I thought needed to be addressed, which I mentioned earlier, looking at digital, looking at inclusivity and diversity, looking at the role of governance for a new world, looking at new income sources, those things require new people in operational roles, that is working for the organization, new collaborations, new board members for sure, and new leaders. Here's a problem. In our last seminar, Lea Stultrager from Berlin was talking a lot about digital. She works on the interface of digital and art. She's an artist by nature, but works in the technical, in the digital sphere. And we asked her how could an organization in the cultural sector take forward a digital agenda? Because it doesn't contain, generally speaking, it doesn't really contain digital specialists. And her answer was, the leadership needs to change. Basically, her argument, which I have to say has some sense, is that you cannot lead an organization into what for a cultural organization is probably a digital future, which for other parts of the economy has been a digital past. You cannot lead into a digital future if a leader of your organization does not really understand the nature of digital production, digital consumption, digital engagement. They don't have to be expert, they just have to understand the territory very well enough to be able to hire the right people, well enough to be able to make the right collaborations, and well enough to assess whether the organization is doing well enough in these spheres. Our future cultural organizations will be much more digital than they are now. And the interplay between digital and physical will be new. There are some organizations that are already doing this very well, though they tend to be smaller, nimbler, artist-led organizations, not the big cultural organizations that we're all familiar with. Another example is diversity and inclusivity. A group of old white men like me sitting around a table cannot really work out a new strategy for inclusion and diversity. It's just not possible for obvious reasons. So if our organizations are generally going to be diverse and inclusive, that has to start really with leadership. We haven't in the Netherlands had the great cataclysm of Black Lives Matter this year, which has really impacted every organization in the United States, especially in fact in the cultural sector. The cultural sector in the United States is undergoing a transformation before our eyes on who runs those cultural organizations and how they engage with their different communities. That has not yet happened in the Netherlands. It will happen more slowly here, but it must happen right now. And that means different people, not just different thought processes. So I'm going to leave that there because I want to really allow Iris to spend most of the time we have talking. But I'm going to leave you. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to talk about how you can find examples of this kind of change. Leonard Bouquenier, in our very first seminar, made a point, which I think is incredibly valid, which is that everything we're grappling with, all the changes we need to make, other people have already done them. It's not that they're brand new. Other people have already been through these processes. And so the solutions to all these problems lie with other sectors. And you really need to be looking outwards to find out other people who've dealt with these problems and found some solutions. Many of them will be applicable to the cultural sector, even within a different context. And so the sector cannot find the answers to these questions inside. The cultural sector cannot only talk with itself. A bubble is a very dangerous thing, and it will not do for the future, which is changing. Look outside, find help from outside of various kinds. I'm going to leave you with a takeaway, which in fact is now the slogan for our next seminar, which is about local government's role in these changes, which is from Einstein again. You can't use an old map to explore a new world. Basically, we need new maps. And although we don't quite yet know what the new world is going to look like, we do know we better start sketching it out, or else we're going to end up drowning in what we're left behind.